Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. I'm tuning in from Germany at the moment, to be exact, in Bonn. And so we will discuss today wild foods and biodiversity. And I will share my screen with you for a short presentation. Before we start, I'd like to request you guys to get your pen and paper. First, I will ask you to take note of two things. First is things that you learn from the presentation or even from the discussion later. So I call this aha. So it's like, aha, I learned something new today. And secondly, I ask you to also write things that make you, huh? What's that? So that was not so clear. So these are two things that I would like you to jot down on your pen and paper, and hopefully we get to discuss this later on during the breakout groups. So let's start. What is the definition of biological diversity? Most of us have heard about biodiversity. We've been to conferences, always saying biodiversity, etc. However, just to have a level discussion, I put here the definition of biological diversity as written by the Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD. So it essentially says that it's variability among living organisms from all sources. So that's terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic ecosystems. So that's saltwater and freshwater, and the ecological complexes of which they are part of, and includes diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. So this means like between animal and plants, or within animals and plants, for example. And so last year, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, also known as FAO, actually published the State of the World's Biodiversity for Food and Agriculture. I'm sure some of you have already seen this. And a takeaway from this is that the future of food is under severe threat. So just looking at plants, so there are 6,000 plant species available as food, but there are only less than 200 varieties eaten by us. And to top it off, only 9 of these varieties actually constitute most of the world's total crop production. So if we can see, in terms of the biological diversity, there is much diversity, but our food intake, our consumption, is mostly concentrated on a small number, which is 9 with its total crop production. And this raises the question, what is also the future of wild food? So it has been said that nearly 25% of roughly 4,000 wild food species are also in decline, sadly. And this, surprise, is mostly happening in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So countries where we are part of. And it's because of increasing pressure of the natural habitats of this wild food species. So as usual, development, conservation, exclusion, meaning protected areas. So this is one of the long-standing debates of excluding people from their traditional lands. And of course, industrial agricultural expansion. So, however, I'm also interested very much in what all of us actually consume. And so we see here that wild food contributes to agrobiodiversity. And the diversity of crops and animals from wild foods are said to contribute to systems to be resilient to climate and market shocks. So one example of this market shock is during this COVID-19. So you can see here that Vietnam this year stopped the signing of new rice export because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And there has been, this is sort of a market shock, that we can see those countries that are dependent, Philippines, for example, dependent on rice imports, food security could be affected. So the question is, how could wild foods also bring in aspects of food security for us? And so I invite you to get your browsers or smartphones ready, because I wanted to ask, what type of wild foods do you usually eat? So if you get your smartphone and then go to menti.com, I will do that now. So type in menti.com, also on your browser, on your computer. And then my internet is also a bit slow, but let's type in 2165201 and then press submit. There's a question there. What type of wild food do you mostly eat? So this is the wild food that usually we eat. And I guess for those of us who are based in urban areas, this could also be an exercise for us to think of the food that we usually eat, and are there any wild food that we eat? So do you usually eat mostly plant-based wild food? Do you usually eat mostly animal-based wild food? Or you equally eat plant and animal-based? So I will invite you to just click a choice and then submit. So the voting results is that, wow, most of us are mostly eating plant-based wild food. So some are still voting, and then equally plant and animal-based. There are also like a quarter of us who are attending this webinar. And then mostly animal-based wild food, 14%. So we see here that for our discussion later, most likely the discussion will be dominated about plants or plant wild food. However, we see that there are people who also equally eat plant and animal-based wild food. So thanks for those who voted. Later on, you can still vote in case you still haven't voted for now. And then let's go back to our presentation. The question is, are there actually models that we could follow for sustainable wild food, sustainable wild food consumption? And an example that I found, this is a question whether it can be a model or not, is the multiple use strategy by the indigenous Totonac in Mexico. So it's, when it says multiple use strategy, they use the forests differently. So they have the primary forest where they gather wild foods, but on the other hand, they also have managed forests for non-native species. They also use secondary forest for shifting cultivation. Their diets are mostly dominated by maize. So that's where the milpa is. You could see here, milpa. And then they also have pasture lands, or also called potrero, where you have the cattle grazing, etc. So aquatic systems and home gardens as well. So this is one type of a home garden. The question is this a model that we could actually use? Or is this even already being used in your localities? And this is something that we can discuss later on. And so there are challenges for wild foods and biodiversity. On a global level, the FAO report mentioned that nutritional and conservation data on wild species is often missing. So it was rather also a challenge for me to look for resources, references for this presentation, because conservation data on wild species is really missing. And on a local level, it has been said that there is also decline in food relevant local ecological knowledge, meaning that this has been, or this is now being replaced by just buying from stores, for example, and the younger generations no longer engage in gathering wild food. So this is one of the challenges. And recently, we also have challenges in relation to emerging infectious diseases like COVID-19. So in terms of conservation exclusion, we have the wildlife consumption ban. And the surprising thing here, or maybe it's not surprising, conservationists actually welcome this ban. So in China, they welcome it, and they want that this would be expanded. However, there are also some conservationists who are actually pushing for taking a step back, thinking thoroughly, because communities, local communities, indigenous and local communities depend on wildlife consumption. And so one of the things that has been proposed is to have biodiversity conservation to mitigate the risk of the emergence of infectious diseases from wildlife. So here is an article that says deforestation and extinction, wildlife extinction, actually make pandemics more likely. It is because when you lose different species, most of the species that are left are often those who are hosts for these diseases. So it could be mostly the emerging infectious diseases were seen in mammals. So, and I'm not sure if there's a correlation there that most of the mammals are the ones left after the degradation, forest degradation, etc. So now the question is whether we have good practices or models from your communities, and what are the challenges in terms of having sustainable use and contribution to biodiversity, also with the issue of COVID-19 and the wildlife consumption bans. And lastly, what are your recommendations for policy and action? So we now proceed first to getting some reactions from our guests who we would like to invite to provide some reflections about these issues. So I would like to first invite Sir Teddy Bagilat, who is the current president of the ICCA Consortium. So just to give you a bit of introduction, he belongs to the Tuwali tribe of Ifugao and the Gadang tribe of Nueva Vizcaya provinces in the northern Philippines. And he has also held various positions in government, including as mayor of Kiangan, governor of Ifugao, and congressman representing the Lone District of Ifugao, where he was able to champion the cause of all indigenous peoples in the Philippines. So he has also proposed laws to protect the rights of indigenous peoples, promote the culture, as well as laws on protection of the environment and bills against discrimination of marginalized sectors. So he is also now the interim executive director of the ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights. And he has spoken in various international conferences on ICCAs, conservation and heritage sites, human rights, and indigenous cultures. Of course, emphasizing indigenous practices as key to overcoming current environmental and sustainability challenges worldwide. So, Sir Teddy, I would like to invite you to provide any reflections, if you had any aha moment or any moments.
Thank you, Denise. Okay, I will just share briefly my reflections on what has been discussed, primarily focusing on my policy assessment of the situation in the Philippines, as well as some policy recommendations, given that my experience, although I'm the president of the ICCA Consortium, but my experience largely has been in terms of legislation, of pushing forth policies in Congress. So in recent decades, because of government policies and programs and the aggressiveness of multinational corporate farming, I would say that there has been a marginalization of small farmers and neglect of locally produced food and community-based farming. And this is where perhaps wild food belongs with. So food production has largely shifted from small farms to large plantation type farms. That has been our experience in the Philippines and I guess most of Southeast Asia. And this has been strengthened by liberalization policies since we're all part of this global world trade network. So the Philippines as well as other countries have adopted liberalization policies that has brought about by an export-import oriented economy. That's what we have right now in the country. And it meant that food supply relied on cheap imports, as well as food production was geared towards supplying foreign markets. So for instance, in the Philippines, we had a rice tariffication law, which allowed private sector to import directly our staple, which is rice from overseas. And because governments did not invest enough on agriculture infrastructure and technology and given and provided capital for local farmers, many rice farmers ceased producing rice because they just couldn't compete with rice farmers from Vietnam and Thailand, which was heavily subsidized by their own governments. Conversely, large agricultural lands were converted towards serving foreign markets. So this would mean that lands that was reserved for rice as well as corn was converted to pineapple or banana plantations, or even biofuels like palm oil. And then suddenly COVID-19 erupted. So it changed everything. It revealed certain weaknesses of our agricultural system in the Philippines as well as the region. It brought about the disruption of the food supply chain. And as Denise had mentioned, the countries halted their imports as they decided to take care of ensuring the food security of their own populations, like for instance, Vietnam and Thailand, from which we used to import a lot of rice. Of course, the supply chain disruption is also brought about by the lockdowns that halted trade and transport of goods locally and overseas. Like for instance, in the Philippines, for a while, food couldn't be transported because of the lockdowns and commercial farms ceased operations. But not for small farms. They continued producing or supplying food, at least for their own family and communities. And if there's one thing that the pandemic has revealed, it was the importance of developing food resilient communities, like what we have among indigenous communities or so-called territories of life, like the ICCAs. This is one of the characteristics of ICCAs or territories of life. In fact, in one webinar discussion that was organized by the ICCA consortium, most of the stories of the participants from indigenous and local communities relate about communities surviving pretty well during the pandemic. They had less infections because they didn't have to go out the cities or outside their communities to buy food or source their sustenance because their food was already supplied within their own communities. I think this is something that we need to look in terms of policy recommendations. Well, because definitely there's going to be a new normal. We've already been discussing a lot about this. And I'm just glad that I was one of the authors of this law in the Philippines, the Sagip-Saka law, which provides support from government to community-based farmers, providing assistance to small farm holdings. And likewise, among other things, the provision of that law, it provides or gives the mandate for local governments to buy food from their own local farmers. Because as I had explained earlier, the food supply in the Philippines has been dependent on large commercial plantations or cheap imports from overseas. Now, because of the pandemic, governments or local governments who wanted to ensure that their communities do not become hungry can now source or buy food from their own local communities. And many LGUs took advantage of this law to buy food as relief from their own farmers instead of relying from national food relief. So I think more than ever, there's a need for us to put a halt to liberalization policies, or at least reflect on whether liberalization policies have helped the agricultural sector, and instead rely on our own local farmers. Among the policy recommendations I would propose, of course, is the passage of the ICCA law in the Philippines to recognize governance of indigenous peoples over the territories that they have been conserving. Likewise, I think it's important that we should already pass in Philippine Congress the National Land Use Act, because it allows for governments for local governments, it gives the local governments mandate to declare certain areas as protected areas. Mm-hmm. And as Denise had mentioned, there's now a push for us to protect our biodiversity, especially with this pandemic, and with the NALUA, which has been lingering in Congress for 2 decades already. Governments can declare certain biodiversity enclaves as protected, at least for 30 years. Now, that's what the provision of the law provides for. And likewise, we are also looking forward to the stricter and more efficient and effective implementation of the expanded NIPAS Act, or the National Integrated Protected Area System, although this is largely state-run conservation. So if you have the expanded NIPAS Act, which talks about government's responsibility to protect areas, and then you have the ICC law, which provides the mandate to biodiversity governance of indigenous and local communities. And then you have the National Land Use Act, which now gives local governments also responsibility to protect the area. Then I think that would strengthen the policy framework in terms of conservation, at least in the Philippines. And finally, as to the ban on wildlife trade, yeah, I think that's something that we need to reflect upon, because for me, I'm quite conflicted, because we in Ifugao, we eat bats, for instance. We eat a lot of wildlife. I don't know if it has done damage to the society as a whole. No? But I think banning wildlife consumption is like looking at the problem from the wrong perspective. No? Sure, there is scientific data that COVID-19 may have been born by bats. I'm just not sure whether anyone really trades in bats. But we should look into the larger picture, and that is that we have been actually intruding into the habitats of wildlife because of our development efforts, whether these are agricultural plantations or extractive industries or even human settlements. No? Our global development trends have destroyed biodiversity, and I think that is the bigger culprit instead of banning wildlife consumption. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Teddy. That was very interesting. So that was very rich, and I hope that later on in our discussion, we will be able to discuss further the one that you mentioned about the resiliency of communities, the wildlife consumption ban, and different policy recommendations that I hope our participants from other countries could also contribute later on. So in terms of an ASEAN perspective, I would now like to invite Ms. Claudia Binondo, who would speak on behalf of Ms. Clarissa Arida, who is the head of the Program Development and Implementation Unit of the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity. So for the others who are not familiar with ACB, it is an institution established in 2005, relatively young, and located in Los Baños, Philippines, with a purpose to facilitate cooperation and coordination among ASEAN member states on the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the use of such biodiversity within the region. So it also serves as the Secretariat of ASEAN Heritage Parks Program, which is one of the flagship programs promoting a regional network of national protected areas of high conservation importance. So coming back to what Sir Teddy mentioned earlier about the NIPAS Act, this is quite relevant, and which also represents ASEAN's rich natural heritage. So I would like to invite now Claudia to give your thoughts as well.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Denise, for the introduction on ACB. And as always, ACB is grateful and honored to have been part of this experts group. As we also need to, it's important also for us to widen our network as we strengthen our efforts in mainstreaming biodiversity in other sectors. So, including agriculture and all others that are considered as major drivers of biodiversity loss. So despite the fact that their development rely primarily on biodiversity. And the first session, which was in June, was actually enlightening for ACB. It gave us a glimpse into wild foods like that boy mentioned by Madhu Ramnath in his presentation on exploring wild food and related matters, who easily identified the kinds of yams in the place where he grew up. That showed the important link between wild foods and the communities that have lived close to where these resources are, who nurture them through generations. We also understood the role of wild foods in enhancing global food security, but also enabling local consumption to maintain these wild foods where they are found. That discussion also noted the increasing commercialization of wild foods resulting in overharvesting, which threaten their sustainability. In the second session, which is the customary tenure rights, traditional food systems, and knowledge, ACB actually participated subgroup, which is on tenurial rights. The group shared good experiences from across Southeast Asia, including India's production. They are also as important to focus on. So we need to focus also on these opportunities. For this session, we need to look at wild foods and biodiversity with an eye towards the future. It is important for us to consider various ways on how wild foods may be conserved and sustainably used for the long term. We also need to address the intertwined concerns on the rights of communities over these resources. Currently, all these concerns are being addressed by the Convention on Biological Diversity, or the CBD. And then through the CBD, we can build our capacities and also that of communities in dealing with these intertwined issues of utilization and management of this biodiversity or natural resources. And we can also work with the parties to the convention, which all the ASEAN member states are parties to. We need, however, to move fast because as we speak, biodiversity worldwide is continuously being lost. So we have that recent report from the IPBES, or the one you mentioned, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. That report said that a total of over 25,000 species are threatened with extinction, and also noted that 95% of these described species have not yet been evaluated. This means we don't even fully know what species, plants, or animals have lost already, and we haven't fully identified what they are. So with this challenge, we need to look forward. We need to look closely at the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which is currently under discussion in the CBD. This framework will help us guide our efforts to reduce the loss, which means this is what is meant by mainstreaming biodiversity in all sectors, including the economic sector, which are identified as what I've said as drivers of biodiversity loss. The ACB right now is working to study the emerging elements of the framework, and including also the emerging issues on pandemics and the COVID-19. We hope to give them input so the region may speak with common voice in the upcoming negotiations for the framework. So in closing, we look forward to the discussions where we may find ways of working together to reduce biodiversity loss while benefiting the communities. So if there will be more time, and we could take up or push for the recognition of their indigenous community conserved areas also. So we have to all to work. We all have. We will all live in harmony with nature, which is actually the goal of and the need to protect 30% of the Earth's surface, both in the marine and terrestrial ecosystems by 2030. This is, if you've heard of.
Yeah, we lost the last part.
Recent in the years to come.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah, thank you.
Claudia, thank you. We missed
Yes.
parts of your final words.
Oh.
Yeah, maybe you could repeat a little bit?
Yes, the 30 by 30 ambition or goal, which is to protect the 30% of the Earth's surface, both in the marine and terrestrial ecosystems.
Okay,
so,
okay. So I think we might have lost her, but I'm sure in the breakout groups we can ask her about it again. Now, coming back, let's go to our breakout sessions. Here are our questions for the breakout group. So it's for those who were with us the last time, they're quite similar actually. So what are the good practices or models of sustainable use and of wildlife and their contribution to biodiversity? What are the challenges? And I guess this relates also to the issue of COVID-19. And Congressman Teddy had a very good, very rich intervention earlier about this. And lastly, what are your recommendations for policy and action? I hope everyone will find it interesting and would be very enthusiastic in sharing your views during the breakout groups. Thank you very much.
Our group had an interesting discussion. I'll try to lump it into some key areas. And then Denise will also add some more, and the other participants if I've left out certain things. The key areas I've noted is one is change due to deforestation, climate change that happens and how that's affecting wild foods. Second is politics, policies in general, laws, and economic politics. How is that affecting forests? How is that affecting consumption, what people produce and what people consume? Third is a very interesting discussion on knowledge. Who has it? Who thinks they have it? Who doesn't know that they have it, but they actually have it? And the channels where knowledge passes, and the channels where people feel that those who have knowledge, where these people exist and are recognized. Okay, so the first regarding deforestation. So we had discussion from Hong from Vietnam, who's been working for a long time with ethnic minorities in Vietnam, and he was telling us about how much people are dependent on forests, but now that there's a lot of loss of forests, where hydroelectric dams have been set up and the rivers don't work like they used to anymore, where people don't depend on forest food anymore because of the conversion, then it's difficult to talk about forest food and wild food. Similarly, I also shared myself about what's happening in Papua, where they're the largest producing region in terms of sago, but now people are eating less and less, and more rice and other foods are coming in. So that's also because of some conversion and also the change in terms of inputs from the modern world. In terms of politics, so Doris shared that many changes in terms of food have been policy driven in terms of a simplification of what we eat, what we don't eat, and what Denise said about the 9 major crops that we now all seem to feed on. Hong also stressed on this with the politics between China and Vietnam, which dictates what Vietnam produces. And he says also that 80% of rubber in China is from Vietnam. So that's how much. So if China stops buying, like he said, they stop buying mango, that affects their industry very, very much. So I did talk about certain policies in Indonesia that looked promising, or certain initiatives. Like we talked about how teachers in Papua are starting to reintroduce sago at nursery level, because they're starting to forget, especially in Jayapura, the city. So these are some initiatives, because once your tongue forgets it when you're older, you'll not want it again. So you have to want it when you're early. And also now having reserves, sago reserves, and not only rice reserves in emergency cases. Okay, and then we talk about knowledge a lot, and how Doris has also stressed about the wild foods that exist and are being preserved and conserved are also there in the context of a culture that is being recognized, appreciated, and practiced. She also talked about, for example, the Ayurvedic industry in India, which has a culture and a history behind it. And I also spoke about the Punan, who also have a strong hunter-gatherer culture behind the wild foods that they eat. And Melanie discussed as well about the changing patterns in terms of what people like to taste, aesthetics of food, and these are driving decisions in terms of purchases, in terms of consumption. Also, Doris related to this in saying that those who are eating these wild foods have previously in the past been said to be backward, uneducated, unschooled. So there maybe has to be a rethinking of this and a rediscovering of cultures and our species and systems. Denise mentioned about the multiple model of forests. How can we come back to this in a new model? And Hong mentioned community enterprises. How can community enterprises and new models of multiple forests converge to be both an economic and an ecological system to provide both benefits for nature and for people and for humans and for animals? So that's what I have in my notes. I hope, Denise, if you have anything to add, you can please kindly do so, and our friends in our group as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ate Chrissy. It was very good. I will add the recommendations from Doris, which were on organization of indigenous and local communities into local groups, so they themselves could have economic identity, like cooperatives, and then having research support. And then she also mentioned about the worrisome closing of indigenous schools, like the Lumad schools in the Philippines. So I think this type of schools, we could recommend that they should stay, and on a policy level, we have to also push for it. Okay. I hope we pretty much covered everything. Next would be Ate Femi. Yeah, okay.
My group, so Jeremy will share.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, hi all. So we started off with looking at that Mexican model, and wondered about how it's different, and we felt that these models are all over Asia, but in Mexico, and Teddy agreed that they have much more autonomy, they have more voice, they have more capacity perhaps to be able to argue their case. So there's a lot of things that we need to look at in terms of being able to people to defend their rights. And then we went to a place like India, where people have lost all their land, these Advasis people. And there's organizations helping with malnutrition because they have no land. They are getting impacted by forest destruction. And one of the forest destructions is actually a REDD+ process where we're trying to reduce emissions, and well, basically it's just clearing forests to plant commercial forests so they can get income from it, and then call that an RD, a REDD+ process. And so, and at the same time, these people are losing, they're becoming the young children are becoming malnourished, and so there's have to help these people. Some of it is to try and get the food systems working again, kitchen gardens where they can go to the forest and bamboo and mushrooms and things like that, so that even where the forests are degraded, there are some food systems that people can use, you know, like I just said. So that's quite important. We've got to think about these policy issues and how they're impacting on people. After that, we briefly talked about Indonesia, where people are doing well in from the COVID problem. People in the forest areas are doing much better, and this is becoming much more obvious, that resilience, the whole issue of resilience, and we really have to push this now. Now's the opportunity. And so there is this, as Teddy was saying, the small farmer model, and this resilience from the small farmer model. And there's I don't know if you call it a change in thinking, but from a few years ago, for example, in Laos or Cambodia, where it was all about bringing the big companies in, all of a sudden the governments are saying, oh my gosh, we need the small farmers because it's going to cost us so much to be able to keep all those small farmers alive if we have to give them food, and we need these little. So maybe there's a change of thinking going on, and I don't know about other countries, but I've just noticed it just recently, and so I agree with Teddy's argument about the small farmer model and how we're going to build that biodiversity, agrobiodiversity, and small farmers. Then we got into a little bit about this whole discussion about the targets, the 30-30 targets,
Yeah.
and how some bureaucrats want targets, but advocates want as much biodiversity as possible, not 30 and 70, no biodiversity, you know, sort of things like that. So that's a whole kind of, that's a big issue too. And the other issue is that there's very little data about how much indigenous people, and let's just say customary people, not necessarily indigenous people, they actually protect. And we don't have enough about, you know, there's areas of indigenous and where they are and all around the world and everything, but in terms of, I suppose, in terms of wild food, in terms of other resources, there's not enough coming out of what it is that is important and being looked after and protected that nobody really knows about. Apart from all of that, I think it's basically just a case of this idea of multi-stakeholder consultations. We need to have much more voice of different kinds of people in this discussions about agrobiodiversity and about biodiversity. And I don't know, Femi, carry on.
Yeah, I think you captured most of it. Just an additional about the 30-30 target. So Teddy was saying that a bit difficult and can be debated. So if we try and adopt just the state targets of 30%, what does that mean? That it's okay for the rest to not be conserved, or we don't care what will be in there in the forest, as what India example had said, that there is a response to climate change with REDD+, but then the types of species that have been planted are not actually useful for communities. So the question is to how do we also continue to advocate outside of the state target biodiversity conservation, because there's a lot that's not being considered. And that includes also ICCAs. So there's a push, because while they might be recorded or considered as possible other area-based conservation measures, but then there's not much data or documentation that's supplemented, then it might not be considered or counted. So the challenge that Teddy was posing was how to continue to advocate autonomous enclaves of biodiversity conservation. Yeah, and how to continue with the multi-stakeholder consultation to lend a voice to that area of policy advocacy and on other area-based conservation measures to involve in that, to engage in that. How to also bring in wild foods in the agrobiodiversity discussions, because agrobiodiversity is now being touted as also an area where there could be support. So that's an opportunity. And then to continue to develop and strengthen capacities of groups such as this, like community-based groups, to be able to document, map out, and then communicate, so that the local level experiences can be scaled up nationally.
Okay, yeah, thank you. All right, and so last but not the least, we have Dazzle and Diana.
We basically moved to straightforward to just answering the questions, and we're able to get all except for those who were dropped off of the call. For some good practices, Sir Ping and Ms. Clau of ACB mentioned that they're trying, ACB in their work, they're trying to break the silos of working on of different sectors working on biodiversities at the regional level. So trying to reach out to other sectors and to other groups and linking the work of biodiversity into health and other related sectors. They also have good project experience in Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia, where the value chain model is used in developing MSMEs with their GIZ funded projects, and sustainability is embedded in the framework of the value chain model. Dr. Grace shared that in looking at directly on models or best practices in a research perspective, such practices and models are can be possible if socio-ecological aspects, whether it's forests or ecosystems, are still closely linked. In their studies, it is currently being, and as mentioned by Denise, it's currently being disrupted by different external and internal drivers within the communities or within the IP groups. And it's also good to not only look into models, but also look into the underlying variables that enables these models to be implemented or to be practiced. I'll just go on to the good practices first. So, and maybe the challenges. Another good practice that Jafari shared is their work in Cambodia on agroecology, integrating pest management, and also making connections with the local government and forest groups. And she mentioned that a good action point is to include valuing nature not only for its use but also for its many different services.
Yeah.
Madhu mentioned that in India there's a shift in language, that is focusing on increasing carbon stock rather than focusing on the biodiversity itself. And Prem shared that in Nepal and in the areas where they work in AIPP, indigenous peoples are being criminalized for collecting wild foods, and there are cases of displacement within the national parks, and these good practices are threatened further by militarization. And we all know that he emphasized that the life of indigenous peoples really depends on nature and the environment, and particularly on collecting and utilizing wild foods. And so he recommends to remove the barriers that prohibits indigenous peoples for experiencing, utilizing these resources. Dr. Razal also emphasized that there's not enough data or pertinent information on wild foods in the region, and it's also good that we advocate for the sufficient and relevant data management and collection. Who are consuming the wild foods? What are they consuming? What kinds of wild foods are they consuming? And to be able to come up with the discourse and relevant recommendations on wild foods. Some other more challenges. There's competing priorities of government in supporting different biodiversity practices and lack of budget. For example, in the case of ACB, in their projects, because the project has ended, so the continuity and sustainability of these projects are is part of the challenge. And also, Ms. Tess, I think, mentioned that the work of NTFP-EP in Macedonia, for example, as providing a platform for different practitioners to discuss and share about their knowledge on wild foods, particularly on honey for Macedonia and other NTFPs. So she recommends that there needs to be an advocacy for relevant policies that support these kinds of initiatives. So maybe Diana can add more to it.
Thank you,
Yes,
Dazzle.
thank you, Daniel. I think you were able to capture most, but just to share that another good practice that was pointed out was the involvement of youth and including them in focused group discussions, as in the
Right.
practice of Munzi, Jeffrey in Cambodia. And then
Right, yes.
forging partnerships and linkages, especially even during the pandemic. So there have been efforts to connect with other like-minded CSOs and individuals to involve them in dialogues such as these. And finally, there was also a sharing by Prem of AIPP. He said that wild foods have been keeping them away from COVID. So they're sustainable and secure in terms of food, but ironically, they're also at the same time being criminalized because when they access their food, sometimes these areas have been converted into parks and they've been displaced by other extractive companies and such. So there is that advocacy or the need to negotiate even at least buffer zones that should still be available for the indigenous peoples and local communities when their areas have already been converted into parks. So there's that ongoing discussion and dialogue, which I think is important to highlight because sometimes governments only.
She got lost.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe just to add on to Diana's sharing, another recommendation that I miss is to advocate and link our work with the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework discussion. And I think there's a lot of sharing already from the other groups about it.
Okay, so we have some interesting links, also insights shared on the group chat. Maybe you guys could also take a look at it. Also with Nuning sharing that the young generation through Millennials for the Forests has been actively promoted in Indonesia since 2009. So thank you, Munize and Nuning. Okay, so I'm not sure if Diana is back. Diana, if you could hear
Yes.
me, yeah, you can finish
Yeah,
whatever.
sorry. I think that was it. I was just saying that there should be an ongoing discussion with how to highlight the importance of wild foods and indigenous peoples' tenure rights, so as to avoid conservation exclusion, as you mentioned earlier. So thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much to everyone who reported. I think we're almost over time. So I would just pick very important things from the three reports that on a local level, there are some opportunities and challenges. However, I think given also the recent killings in the Philippines, I would like to focus on or just mention about the criminalization of indigenous peoples. And as Stories also mentioned, the closure of Lumad schools. This is something that probably we should take very much note of, something that we should, I don't know, it's a very difficult thing. It's about security, etc., lives on the line, but something that in terms of wild foods is also a challenge. So on a global level, we have policies, the post-2020 biodiversity framework. It's, well, hopefully happening next year if COVID will be over. All in all, I think we had a very good session today, and definitely NTFP will send around the summary. So we have very good documenters today. Thank you so much to all of you. And I will now turn over to Ate Femi for final words. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denise, and also to everyone for, again, active participation in our discussion, and a lot of food for thought, and also a lot of recommendations that we can pursue later on for our policy dialogue. So just as an additional overview of what this dialogue series is intended for, or discussion series is intended for, the expert group will be taking on the documentation of all these outputs and from the discussion, and use this to inform and build a concept for a regional policy dialogue that we're hoping to mount and target policymakers, and possibly also even outside of the policy dialogue, that we could probably document these recommendations and deliver and communicate them to such platforms, possibly in the CBD. So there are some entry points for us to include all of these inputs into these processes. So thank you very much. We will post the documentation as we have done in the past discussions. We will post them on 2 pages, the NTFP-EP webpage as well as the SIANI webpage. But if I can ask Robin to then share the screen, we will have our last session for our 4-part discussion series next month on September 22. So this is advance notice to everyone. Please register as usual. When you receive this banner, you will see them on your emails. September 22, the same time, 3:30 p.m. Manila time. And we will have same type of format. Hope to see you again.